On va commencer. Alors, aujourd'hui, nous allons recevoir un invité pour nous précieux. Il s'agit d'Andrej Radmann, qui est professeur de philosophie et de théorie de l'architecture et aussi coordinateur du groupe de recherche sur les écologies de l'architecture à la faculté d'architecture et d'environnement de l'université de Delft. Bon. Je dirais qu'en quelques paroles, il est membre du comité national sur Deleuze et Guattari, une sorte de scholarship, membre du conseil consultatif de la Society for Study of Affect, et il est rédacteur en chef de la production et membre du comité de rédaction de la revue Full Footprint. Donc, il traite de théorie de l'architecture comme second. Voilà, donc il a publié un certain nombre de textes et de livres, et en particulier, un travail sur se nomme Critical and Clinical Cartographies en 2017, qui nous intéresse particulièrement. Enfin, moi, même Toufik, on est sur ce genre de sensibilité. Aussi Architecture of Life and Death en 2021 et Spice of Technicity qui doit apparaître par ailleurs. Et il y a aussi un dernier ouvrage qui se nomme No Ethics Without a Mind qui est aussi à apparaître. Un livre important, c'est aussi celui qui a été publié en 2012 qui se nomme Gibsonism, donc comme le nom l'indique, autour de Gibson, et concernant les écologies de l'architecture. Voilà, donc il a reçu un certain nombre de prix, il a construit aussi, donc c'est un praticien par ailleurs, et par conséquent, nous avons une personne, comment dire, experte entre l'expérience concrète vivante de la pratique architecturale et surtout la question de son analyse et de son décryptage théorique parmi les meilleurs, pour ma part en tout cas, des meilleurs théoriciens actuels. Voilà, je vais lui, le titre de la conférence est Environnements transindividuels, et je vais laisser la parole à Andrej qui fera une conférence évidemment en anglais, et nous essaierons de faire en sorte que nous passions de la langue française à la langue anglaise avec aisance. Voilà, je laisse la parole à Andrej.
Merci beaucoup. Thank you so much. I'm really happy to be here with my colleagues, and I can say friends, Patricia, Prof, the Gibsonian family here in Paris. Thank you so much for this opportunity to speak to you, including the guests, some of whom I've read, but I haven't had a chance to meet as yet. So let me start immediately. The basic definition of affect comes from Spinoza, who spoke of the power to affect and be affected as what defines a body and a life. A power to affect and be affected, this is an epigraph I'm reading from Masumi, is a potential to move, act, perceive, and think, in a word, powers of existence. The to be affected part of the definition says that a body's power of existence are irreducibly relational, in my vocabulary, ecological. They can only be expressed in dynamic relation with other bodies and elements of the environment. The power to affect and the power to be affected are inseparable. They are two sides of the same coin. They are reciprocals, growing and shrinking as a function of each other. So from the start, affect overspills the individual. This is very important. Tying its capacities to its relational entanglement with others and with the outside. And Masumi underscores, affect is thus fundamentally trans-individual. The pressing problem of today, ecological, ethical, and political, if you want, all these problems do not fit neatly within a single disciplinary boundary. This means that the future of caring and balancing environments will depend on the capacity to cultivate what I call a culture of trespassing that renders transdisciplinarity indispensable. So we have to be able to trespass, go beyond our disciplinary boundaries. Transdisciplinarity should be distinguished from interdisciplinarity. While interdisciplinarity operates on the basis of general equivalence, transdisciplinarity can be read as a critique of the substantialist tradition. The tradition, this substantialist tradition, has contributed to the present misunderstanding of relation as interaction. So what I'm trying to say, that relation is not the same as interaction, because interaction always occurs between fully constituted terms, namely the knowing subject and the known object. And this is why I use this Baran-Barad's term interaction. So not interaction, but interaction that you see on the screen. On the other hand, is interested not in the given, the manifest level of reality, but in how the given is given, or the quasi-causal relation that cannot be reduced to its terms. So my presentation will consist of mapping the role of affect, which to me is a near synonym of affordance, in a heteropoiesis that resists the collapse of the sensible to the intelligible, they are not the same, that resists the collapse of sentience to sapience, that resists the collapse of the unconscious desiring into apperceptive volition, so desiring and volition are very different, and finally the resists the collapse of the singular significance into linguistic signification, so significance versus signification. A pedagogy of the senses, whose logic of sensation is sympathetic with the logic of relation, can trace a path out of anthropocentrism and also anthropomorphism. By recasting subjectification, the process in which we become subjects, in terms of non-human forces within the human. Such approach avoids the poorly based question of what affects/affordances are, and instead focuses on what they do. So the short answer is that affordances play a very significant role in the processes of subjectification. I will argue that thought emerges involuntary, provoked by asignifying signs, the Guattarian term. But why would an architect, you may ask, be interested in something that at first glance appears unrelated to architecture? Well, that depends on how we define architecture. I happen to follow those who consider architecture irreducible to structures. Instead, architecture is best approached in terms of operations, what it does. Its primary function is the production of affordances, which should not be underestimated at all, especially once we agree that thought does not originate in thinking. As Deleuze put it, something in the world forces us to think. Architecture cannot be reduced to its ontic register, and the aversion to reductionist strategies and entailments is precisely what the term ecology stands for. So ecology for me is about relationality and irreducibility. Unfortunately, the concept of ecology has been conflated with greenwashing and needs to be rescued from such idiocy. Inspired by Felix Guattari, I will argue for architecture's role in anthropogenesis, not simply in the world, but with the world. The experience of architecture in the built environment goes beyond empirical conditions. It is prospective and not limited to what is presently visible to the eye. To paraphrase the radical empiricist, William James, we are virtual knowers way before we are actual knowers. Affect, as the capacity to affect and be affected, differs from affection because it is not subjective. Interestingly, it is not objective either, or it is both at once. This is in fact how Jeremy Gibson, the founder of the School of Ecological Perception, defines the concept of affordance as the potential for action available in our environments. The reason why affect/affordance is not objectifiable or divisible is that it is relational or ecological. This reversal, where relations are antecedent to their terms, to their relata, may be disorienting for those accustomed to representational thought. However, if we continued to pursue the philosophy of access, where a fully constituted subject relates to a discrete object over there, we will perpetuate what Alfred North Whitehead calls the fallacy of misplaced concreteness. As Gilles Deleuze put it, the opposite of the concrete is not the abstract, but the discrete. When I read this, it took me a while to figure out. So the word, just to remind ourselves, the word concrete has a very different etymology from discrete. Concrete comes from the Latin word meaning grown together, while discrete comes from the Latin word meaning separated. By replacing the traditional pairing of concrete and abstract with the unconventional pairing of concrete discrete, we can gain a new ethico-aesthetic perspective. Concretion involves a material ethics that challenges the dogmatic morality. According to Georges Caniem, life itself becomes a normative activity, a continuous revaluation of values in Nietzschean terms, and such normativity establishes rules that are only ever contingently obligatory. The world is not ontologically separated into distinct parts, what Erin Manning calls chunking, and there is nothing inherently necessary about it. Instead, it continuously evolves along with its teleonomies and epistemologies. Karan Bharat's neologism, ethico-onto-epistemology, was foreshadowed in the Simondonian formula: the knowledge of individuation is the individuation of knowledge. So let me repeat that, because I think this is just wonderfully put. So the knowledge of individuation is the individuation of knowledge. The Baradian entanglement of ethics, ontology, and epistemology may be complemented by Rossi Braitotti's hyphenation of zoe, geo, and techno as constitutive of modern human life. This neologism designates that the organic has always been utterly dependent on the inorganic. This is what we were attempting to show in a book that Patrizio mentioned, Architectures of Life and Death. Again, the emphasis is on processuality, irreducibility, and non-linearity. In one word, on ecology. Whether one has technophilic or Luddite leanings, we were talking about this a little earlier, it is impossible to disregard the ongoing evolution by means other than life, which affects both phenotypical and genotypical individuation in terms of this is a Hitlerian perspective. It is, I hope, beyond dispute that cognition is embodied, embedded, extended, enacted, and affected, known as 4EA paradigm. However, acknowledging the circumstantial character of life is not to be mistaken for a declaration of relativism. So this is not relativism. Simondon's formula from above is not about the relativity of truth, but about the truth of the relative, that is to say, of the relational or ecological. It concerns what is contingently obligatory because things could always have been otherwise. While dogmatism is too quick to fill the gap between being and thought, with always often with a robust, that is to say, with a universal concept, the empirical tradition indulges in leaving it wide open in a kind of skeptical fashion. Similarly, with the twin couple of realism and nominalism, where we are supposed to choose between the mind-independent reality on the one hand and sheer idiosyncrasies on the other, the logic applied is that of the excluded middle. The ecological injunction is to bring the middle back. We have to start thinking through the milieu, par le milieu. And you recognize here Isabel Stengers is a great advocate of this. This is crucial regarding the architectural therapy of the human ecoumene. The concept of affordance becomes crucial. To paraphrase Spinoza, we will never conclusively know what architecture can do. Such an open confession of ignorance liberates us from the hylomorphic approach, where the active supervening force is meant to keep the passive matter in check without really checking on what is going on. Take, for example, the logic of deduction, where the premise already contains all the answers, or the illegitimate extrapolation in the case of induction. Only abduction may be considered plastic enough to avoid the shackles of mechanistic technodeterminism and organistic teleology. Abduction famously operates incrementally and cumulatively by way of infinitesimal hypotheses that are always tested on the go, on the fly. Instead of maintaining a megalomaniac critical distance, quote unquote, a speculative pragmatist approach that I advocate compels one to intervene into the causal fabric of reality so as to tease out salient points. There is no other viable way to distinguish between the necessary and the contingent, or between the singular and the ordinary. In Deleuze and Guattari's theoretical framework, an approach that acknowledges consistency without relying on a totalizing perspective is called rhizomatics, schizoanalysis, stratoanalysis, or micropolitics. The use of the term causal fabric implies a recursive causality that contradicts traditional mechanistic linear causality. The actual state of affairs serves as a cause. Any arrangement of at the level of the manifest reality, which produces an effect, and this effect in turn becomes an incorporeal but real quasi-cause. This quasi-cause, which Deleuze borrows from the Stoic philosophy, determines the degrees of freedom at the manifest level. In The Logic of Sense, 1969, he calls defines the quasi-causality as the causality of the virtue. Love, for example, can be seen as a quasi-cause that is not reducible to the individual lovers. The reciprocal determination between the prosaic cause and the quote-unquote poetic quasi-causal effect is what Gregory Bateson calls the sacred in his later work. The sacred describes the symbiotic relation between the dynamic and static genesis, the upward and downward causation. Charles Sanders Peirce nomenclature identifies three distinct ontological domains: firstness, secondness, and thirdness, which correspond to feeling, action, and learning, respectively. The first domain deals with the particularity of existence, albeit separate from volition and cognition. Thisness, has safety. The second domain pertains to the capacity for adjusting means to achieving ends, involving relationality. It's a struggle. Finally, the third domain concerns the processes of learning and the emergence of what Deleuze and Guattari call larval subjects, where the possessive and expressive aspects are fully conjoined. Interestingly, the expressive aspect comes first, followed by the possessive. If this feeling is mine, then there must also be a me. This triad, firstness, secondness, thirdness, links firmly sensibility to sense as in directionality, and matter to manner, where the matter is finite. We know this from the first law of thermodynamics, while manner, or the style of putting things together, the how, remains unlimited. The apparent oxymoron of unlimited finity is known as the superthought. This is from Deleuze's book on Foucault, 88, or not sure. The term designates the psychosocial individuation that goes beyond psychic individuation. This is the Simondonian term. Again, such transindividuation is not to be confused with interindividuation, which puts already constituted interacting individuals in relation. The ethico-political ramifications are significant. If one does not start from a fully constituted subject, then the concept of a liberal individual who makes rational choices and bears responsibility makes no sense. To truly ecologize our thought, we ought to insert another hyphen, as Donna Haraway does, between the terms response and ability. Response hyphen ability designates the ability to respond through the milieu, which is a matter of power and not of duty. As Gregory Bateson insisted, the basic unit of survival is the organism plus its environment. One cannot leave out the system within which an event is determined. Crucially, the boundary of the system does not coincide with that of the so-called self. This is a wonderful piece from his a quote from his paper on the theory of alcoholism. And I quote him: "Consider a man felling a tree with an axe. Each stroke of the axe is modified or corrected according to the shape of the cut face of the tree left by the previous stroke. The self-corrective, in Batesonian terms, mental process, recursive process, is brought about by a total system: tree, eyes, brain, muscles, axe, stroke, tree. And it is this total system that has the characteristics of the immanent mind. More correctly, he says, we should spell the matter out as differences in tree, differences in retina, differences in brain, differences in muscles, differences in movements of axe, differences in tree, etc. What is transmitted around the circle is transforms of differences. And the difference that makes a difference is an idea or a unit of information. This is a famous definition by Bateson that I find incredibly helpful, that information is the difference that makes a difference. Logical, through. But this is not, he continues, how the average Westerner sees the event sequence of tree felling. He says, instead, I cut down the tree. And he even believes that there is a delimited agent, the self, number one, which performs a delimited purpose in action, number two, on a delimited object, number three, end quote. Despite their remarkable ingenuity, neither William James, the radical empiricist, nor Charles Sanders Peirce, managed to descend from a relatively high level of abstraction. Fortunately, their disciple, J.J. Gibson, did so. In this regard, we will now focus on his concepts developed in the Ecological Approach to Visual Perception, his last and most influential book, which provides several concepts that challenge the traditional representational theory of perception. The hylomorphic formula, which renders an image utterly dependent on consciousness, was most explicitly criticized, of course, by Henry Bergson. It qualifies as a theory of enrichment because it effectively relies on addition. The world supposedly would be completely unintelligible without the contribution of some sort of schema, a Kantian mental category that serves as an ordering device. By contrast, Gibson's direct, non-representational perception is ultimately Bergsonian insofar as it relies on subtraction, so not addition, subtraction. And here I use the lovely title of a paper by William Mays, another Gibsonian, who says, don't ask what's inside your head, but rather what's your head inside of. There is always more to reality than in perception, and the real is not a formless chaotic swirl onto which structure must be imposed by cognitive processes, that is to say, by addition. This is what Deleuze and Guattari refer to as the N+1 element. So adding a supplementary dimension in order to study something that is below, as it were. The transition from the additive to the subtractive approach is consistent with Leibnizian monadology, where the clear and obscure zones depend on the proximity to the point of view or the point, of course, of hearing and smelling. Doesn't necessarily need to be oculocentric, which are always multiple and not even necessarily human. One's clear zone of expression pertains to one's body, and that which exceeds it and remains dark and obscure is the shadow of other monads possessing their own clear zones, all of which converge upon the same world, one world, in the process of perpetual becoming. This is what Guattari describes as transmonadism in cosmosis. Again, a near synonym of transindividuation. Another term for this, for transmonadism, could be is a truth of the relative. Of this truth of the relative is perspectivism. The doctrine of radical perspectivism performs the salto, not mortale, salto vitale, if I can put it this way. It is not the subject that has the point of view, but the reverse. So the point of view pre-exists the subject. Subjectification thus operates through subtractive, so not additive, subtractive and creative framing. Once we move from interpreting hermeneutics to experimenting in terms of this like creative framing, subject becomes effect of affect and affordances. So subject is the effect of affect / affordances. The points of view are continuously individuating, and the variety increases as we move from the inorganic, geo, and organic, zoe, to the alloplastic or technostrata. However, these should not be considered as chronological stages, as this would amount to some ridiculous cosmic evolutionism. Not surprisingly, given his ecological disposition, Gibson's three major concepts map onto Peirce's triad: the ambient optic array, the occluding edge, and affordance. I read, I think it was his wife, who reveals that once a year, Gibson would invite friends for a carnival party, and they would dress up as ambient optic arrays, affordances, and holding edges. I mean, magic. I don't know how they did that. I have to find a photo of that. I welcome people who believe that. Sure, that's not. So we start with the first one, the first concept, ambient optic array. With the concept of ambient optic array, Gibson establishes a key prerequisite for his theory of perception, which is unmediated and thus more than human. As the term itself suggests, there exists a distributed ambient potential for perception that may or may not be tapped into. The intensity and structure of light is at every single potential point of view a temporary resolution of multiple reverberation in the medium. This is what Simonon calls a disparation. Then it arrives at a temporary metastable state. Ambient optic array is not a mental snapshot, but a real composition of relations of differential forces. Under ordinary circumstances, their back and forth becomes stable enough to reveal the layout of the surrounding surfaces. And of course, from Gibson, we know that light can be said to occur across and depend upon surfaces, and it's vastly ignorant of the so-called substances. The notion of environmentality, again, we can write it with a hyphen, environ, the surrounding, and mentality, signifies a post-Darwinian theory of sensibility, where the point of view itself evolves as a result of the active redistribution of the sensible, to use Jacques Rancier's terminology. It is essential, therefore, to emphasize that the ambient optic array need not be limited to the visual mode, as I said already. Gibson was here strategically reductionist and fully aware of the potential for generalization of the concept to include other modalities, such as olfactory, smell, auditory, sound, gustatory, haptic, etc. In any case, optical information is picked up and not rather than processed. It involves the concurrent registration of both change and persistence, difference and repetition in the flow of structured stimulation. Perceptual systems thus resonate to environmental structure without incorporating physical properties of stimulus input. Once we replace the theory of physical causality, so mechanicism, with the theory of asignifying semiotics, nothing crosses the environment boundary, environment body boundary. There is no place for the homunculus who supposedly gathers evidence in what then it calls the Cartesian theater. Information is available in the ambient energy flux rather than as signals in a bundle of nerve fibers, and it consists of invariants rather than forms. This means that the existential niche or ecumeny operates at a very different order of analysis than the world of traditional physics. In contrast to the Cartesian Newtonian universe, where meaning or sense is excluded from the world by definition, the environment is axiological through and through. In the Nietzschean tenor, the world value has no antonym, especially not in the word fact. So now we move to the second concept, occluding edge. One of Gibson's most underrated concept is occlusion, which is connected to the, in my mind, to the Peircean secondness, in that it relates to continuous modification and struggle, quote unquote. If the ambient optic array is the foundation of affordance theory, then the occluding edge may be considered as its ground. That which is temporarily concealed and that which is equally temporarily revealed are bound together by the most ephemeral and crucially reversible component of occlusion. Where is it? Where is the horizon? Is it 4 miles away? Always 4 miles away. This is a convincing example of the logic of the included middle, as the occluding edge literally middles. In contrast to the scientific, this idea of if-then, seeking universal concepts, if 3 angles, then the triangle, we have here a speculative pragmatist tinkering based on the what-if drift. What if I move to the left, move to the right, and therefore I continue, I reciprocally change the occlusion edge. The movement in the latter should not be mistaken for a translation in a pre-established isotropic absolute space as a mere container in Newtonian conception. The extensive space with its denumerable dimensionality is but a derivative of the directional topological modulations. So dimensional space comes out of the directional space. Radical empiricism holds that the relation, in this case occlusion, as the locus of transformation is not only real, but it's also directly really perceived. What is perceived cannot be thought of as analogous to a static image or that appears on your retina, also known as the fallacy of retinalism, because the retina registers invariance in structure rather than points of an image. So Gibson notes that, and this is really like something difficult to wrap your head around if you come from a different tradition. So Gibson notes that images are not even necessary for perception or for thought, for that matter. This fact is clearly demonstrated by the perception of occlusion, where if you perceive occlusion, where one is aware of something in the environment, namely the horizon, let's say, one species of occlusion, yet has no qualitative content of being occluded. Let me read this again. So the fact is clearly demonstrated that images are not even necessary for perception, is that the perception of occlusion when one is aware of something in the environment, namely something is there, yet there is no qualitative content of being occluded. Action, movement executed, and perception, movement received cannot be thought in isolation. What holds them together is the, I don't know if you're probably familiar with this apparently crude experiment where the 2 kittens, newly born kittens, are put in this kind of carousel contraption, like a merry-go-round. One of them walks and observes, the other one is dragged around. It doesn't walk, it simply observes things around itself. And once they are released, the kitten that didn't walk is virtually blind. It bumps into obstacles because it has not developed the sensory motoric synaptic connections. Luckily, it recovers very quickly.
So it looks like Mengele
No,
experiment.
it's not. And interestingly enough, same effect is achieved by stroboscopic light because it cuts the continuity into discrete snapshots. But again, one can recover from it. So what holds the action and perception together is the, in this sense, like the Peircean concept of secondness, where the singular is opposed to the universal, because each occlusion is structurally different, yet operationally isomorphic. This is a Simondonian point. So something can be structurally different, operationally is isomorphic. We perceive in order to act, and act in order to perceive. But who is this we? Is the question. And this brings us to thirdness, affordance. Before we proceed, it is important to emphasize that the triad of firstness, secondness, and thirdness is irreducible and non-chronological. Thirdness is neither connective nor disjunctive, but rather conjunctive. Earlier, we defined affect as shorthand for the capacity to affect and be affected. That's how I started off with the epigraph from Sumi, bringing it in close proximity to the concept of affordance. According to Gibson, affordance is neither objective nor subjective, embodying the logic of the included middle. It is perhaps both as two surfaces of a single topological interval. Peirce connects thirdness to the interpretant's capacity to relate feeling and acting through learning. But the emergent yet constructed interpretant is not antecedent, doesn't pre-exist. And the Simondonian formula fully applies. Once again, the individuation of knowledge equals the knowledge of individuation. Individuation takes place within the fourth milieu, according to Simondon's framework, just to remind ourselves, with the other three milieus being the interior, the past, the exterior, future, and the membrane, which regulates the exchange between the two. In this process, the associated milieu, the annex associated milieu, itself undergoes individuation. The larval subject, as Gattari call it, consumes different affective states that augment or diminish a body's power of existence. Crucially, learning increases the capacity to affect and be affected. It is at this point that one may contemplate the concomitant existence of an I, as hinted above, while experiencing joy or sadness in Spinozian terms as one's own. So this is at this point you realize, oh my God, there is also me, because I'm undergoing all these feelings. I'm consuming them, I'm consummating them. So given that the passive self and the active I never fully coincide in an open system, we may follow Bergson's nomenclature and posit that posit the larval subject as the center of indetermination. If there were such a thing as a center of determination, the different self would collapse into the repeated I. During Deleuze's three passive synthesis of time, we can relate thirdness to futurity and fabulation, which evokes a people irreducible to the existing population. This is where they say a painter doesn't have its audience, it builds it. So a piece of art creates its audience. If the ambient optic array is about the present as the foundation, and the occluding edge is about the pure past, with Bergsonian terms, as the ground, then affordance/affect is about the constituting cut that separates the movement received from the movement executed. This is what I was trying to do with this image, where with simple creatures such as from Uexku's Umwelt theory, Pick is trapped in the Umwelt that consists of three affects. Cat, Bateson teaches us in a wonderful essay where I believe the title is Cat's nip is not a bite. So cat, when it nips, it doesn't bite because it's already capable of understand the concept of play, as if it's not trapped in the vital space as a tick is or a snake or animals you can't play with. Of course, with the human, it gets really complicated because stimulus, the interval is inserted so much so that the effect and cause can actually switch sides, as I was trying to argue in by reference to the quasi-causality. So every identity is internally fissured by multiplicity. The role of affect/affordance opens the present onto the future, onto contingency, onto, you could say, grace as opposed to gravity. Simondon posits the existence of different modes of individuation, including physical, vital, psychical, and psychosocial, each with specific capacities for processing information defined as a difference that makes a difference from Bateson. These modes can be differentiated based on the degree of mnemonic detachability. By that I mean how far memory is detached from the body proper. With epigenetic memory being more exosomatized, thrown out of the body, and possessing a greater capacity to evolve alongside and in addition to the genetic line. Genetic line is passing on DNA from parents to their children. Unlike its organic counterpart, which is transmitted through filiation, epigenetic memory is rhizomatic and conjures up alliances that cut across ingrained categorizations in a transspatial fashion through what Deleuze calls static genesis. In this view, time is no longer just a measurement of movement, chronological time. Static genesis, as opposed to dynamic genesis, starts from virtuality and may engender aberrant nuptials, such as the, let's take the example of rider stirrup horse assemblage. So a person mounting a horse with a device of navigating, steering a horse is an assemblage which runs across all three strata mentioned before. The emergent machinic phylum effectively reverses subordination of time to movement. It's not time as a measurement movement, but time that triggers movement. The accumulation of multiple epigenetics can lead to the emergence of a new form of memory called epiphylogenetic memory. This new form of memory can give rise to a collective memory that opens up a new collective affects and affordances, ultimately leading to a creation of an epoch in Stiglerian terms. The city is a prime example of an epiphylogenetic memory, sedimented, something that we are born into, something that will remain there long after we are gone. Architecture and the built environment, I just said, running ahead of myself, are examples of transgenerational tertiary memory, where they capture forces rather than just representing or imitating nature. Psychic individuation pertains to individualization, whereas epiphylogenetic memory, due to its quote-unquote autonomy in terms of it being exosomatized, thrown out of the body, becomes a significant vehicle of trans-individuation. In other words, epiphylogenetic memory facilitates the creation or fabulation of both non-originary and non-phenomenological I, and the non-socio-deterministic V, collectivity, simultaneously. Affect, in this context, is not personal, but rather a would-be affection, dwelling in the sensory motor interval, just as the trans-individual occupies the caesura between reactions and actions. It's in this kind of middle space in between. Generalization cannot explain anything. This is Lesengatari hammer all the time. They themselves, in generalization, need to be explained themselves. Therefore, we cannot take the subject as a given, as a substance, and instead must engage in ontocartography to understand how the given is given. The mode. Every time we encounter a generalization, it is necessary to map its formal consistency and the operations of power that enables it to pretend to some kind of universality. Enters new materialism, insofar that mapping, so which differs from tracing, operates solely at the level of tendencies, opening a way to intuit long-term capacities. This involves an apprenticeship in priming, which is a complex existential posture that prepares for the possibility of both non-conscious awareness. It's just seems like an oxymoron, but it's not. Non-conscious awareness and conscious elaboration. One must be effectively attuned to the event in its singularities. I'm a little bit critical now of the woke, in agreement with Masumi here, woke movement. Being woke is insufficient as reacting so not acting but reacting, is just a contrary way of being constrained by what one is reacting against. You are caught up in the same game. In contrast to politics with a capital P as power over potestas, acting politically does not capture powers of existence, but becomes their autonomous expression, which is participatory, dynamically engaged with the outside. So as Masumi emphasizes, affect, and we may add, of course, affordance, is essential for experiencing political as power to, so not power over, power to, which is about potential. But this does not mean that we are talking about a purely personal experience. To make the political personal would be to prioritize the subject over affect. And I just said that subject is an effect of affect. Subjectification is machinic, and individuation is a genuine creation where asymmetry is preserved because the actual never fully exhausts the virtual. Therefore, the subject is an asymptotic limit, just like the other two transcendent illusions, the world and God. Again, the subject is not the cause, but an effect of affect defined as a non-human or more than human becoming of the human. Quentin Meillassoux, one of the four OG speculative realists, distinguishes between active and reactive subjects in relation to their associated milieu. The active subject gradually increases the porosity of the membrane that regulates transition between the exterior, past and future, while a reactive subject eventually isolates itself from the world. You see it on the top right on the slide. It is crucial to determine the appropriate level of granularity to avoid the fallacy of misplaced concreteness. While politically minded architecture theorists prioritize the molar scale and programmatic approach, affordance theory calls for descending to the molecular level, where singularities are teased out through leap abstraction as a function of variation. These two approaches are fundamentally different. The former is characterized by messianic moralism, exemplified by Henry Lefebvre's advocacy for the right to the city. On the other hand, the latter perspective suggests that non-unitary subjects are fueled by rhythms, not solely by reason. Paraphrase Jean-Luc Godard, the filmmaker, the objective is not to create a just city, as Lefebvre wanted, but to just create a city. As Deleuze explains, and I quote, the just ideas are always those that conform to accepted meanings or established percepts. They are always ideas that confirm something, even if this something is in the future, even if it's in the future of the revolution. While just ideas is a becoming present, a stammering of ideas, and can only be expressed in the form of questions that tend to confound any answers. So this is going again platitude, cliches and stereotypes. This presentation concludes with a third triad, the triadic diagram. So first we had the Charles on the Spears, then we had the Gibson, and now we move to Marcel Mauss and his gift economy, which in his gift economy he calls it a gift exchange system involving giving, receiving, and returning. If the ambient optic array is given as two juxtaposed patterns, this slide will pop up in a minute. The occluded edge will be rendered sensible or received through the self-induced optical flow, and the returning will comprise augmenting or diminishing powers of action via affordance or affect, joy, and sadness in Spinoza's term. The remaining part of my presentation will offer a tangible example of a pedagogy of the senses that demonstrates the mutual reciprocity of the Gibsonian triad. The reciprocal but asymmetrical determination of giving/feeling, receiving/action, and returning/learning is what causes the ratcheting effect. Ratcheting is this idea, so they move forwards and doesn't come back. I put this give. Just remind yourself. So this is now as it were the most tangible moment in the paper. The three doors. Consider three seemingly identical ambient optic rays pictured as two surfaces textured as they would usually appear in the environment. Every forward locomotion, if we start moving forward, of a point of view, will inevitably produce a looming effect when something grows as you come closer to it. The self-induced optical flow will reveal continuous transformation of patterns both within and without the occluding edge. The resultant speeds and slownesses catalyze affect, rendering the onto power of the flow and the genetic point of view indiscernible. They become one. This is the point, I argue, where nomadology meets monadology. It is less a question of extending a monad's clarified region than of developing its power of action through a speculative pragmatic knowledge, whose definitive characteristic is selectivity, as I said, or subtractive operation of vital framing that ignores anything that is not of interest. Contrary to sedentary distribution by a central authority, nomadic distribution is always self-generated. Our frame of reference thus is n-1. Previously, I was talking about n+1. Idea that we need to ascend to the add dimension in order to study phenomena. Here I'm arguing for the frame of reference in n-1, which means that we do not need to encapsulate the event by ascending to the extra dimension to provide an overview n+1, but rather descend to the topological surface where the doer and the deed are not separated, the Nietzschean point. So let's see what this works now. So to illustrate these points, let's revisit this example. If the rate of change of the central and peripheral patterns is the same, if they loom at the same rate of change, then the surfaces are flush. They belong to the same plane, they are coplanar. If the rate of change of the central pattern is faster, as it happens in the middle image, it represents a protruding obstacle. On the other hand, if the rate of change of the peripheral pattern is faster, as we see in the case of C on the right, it signifies the recessed opening that affords walk-through ability in an asignifying manner. So affordances are only ever pharmacological, which means that the ability to walk through may be a poison or a remedy, depending on what awaits on the other side of the door. Technically, this is a question of compossibility and incompossibility of the assemblage in Synodonian terms. What a body can do is determined ecologically, and it becomes a question of dosage, of how much is endured before reaching a point of bifurcation, threshold, from walk-through ability, reach-through ability, see-through ability, hear-through ability, etc. Ultimately, it becomes a question of permeability of the membrane that regulates the degree of compossibility with regard to the associated milieu. Undoubtedly, it would be easier to explain the difference between the three affordances by reference to an established code, if I was to call this a door immediately. However, we should not submit to the dominance of linguistic signifiers. In the words of Guattari, where does the idea that the socius is reducible to the facts of language and that these facts are in turn reducible to the linearizable and digitalizable signifying chains come from? He's wondering. And me alongside. No signification is determined in advance. The meaning of affordance is not predetermined by resemblance or denotation. Affordance does not derive its meaning from external reality, nor does it represent the psychological state of the subject's mind or the logical essence of the concept, the door in itself, as perceived by the mind. Instead, it is produced immanently through a relation that generates its terms. To effectively remedy overcoding, and when we say door, we immediately overcode because it becomes a door and nothing else anymore, and avoid conflating relation with interaction, it is essential to indeed focus on affect and affordance. As Robin Evans asserted, drawing is not writing and architecture does not speak. Affordances are non-linguistic, extra-propositional and unyoked from discourse. Architecture does not signify, at least not unequivocally. It enunciates and does so collectively. Deleuze and Guattari insist that what we are missing is certainly not communication, there's too much of it as it is, but resistance to platitudes, resistance to the presence. Therefore, we should avoid subsuming all sorts of things under a universal concept, because such concepts tend to be indifferent to what is actually happening. Conversely, singular concepts are always related to those variables that determine the limitations of the concepts. The secret of transcendental empiricism, which is yet another apparent oxymoron, lies in plasticity. Constructivist relates one and many in a way that makes monism and pluralism no longer mutually exclusive. It is not about subjective conditions of generic experience, as phenomenology would want it, but about the real morphogenesis point, including points of view and knowledge. Everything begins with the sensible, but thought must go beyond the sensible to the potential for difference that enables both sentience and sapience. The subject is subtracted from experience, viewed as a collective achievement. It is made up of nothing but the contingently obligatory confluence and configuration of care, food, money, ideas, prohibitions, and capacities from broader social formations that ingests, in particular, Ecoumènes. That's the plural of Ecoumènes. This is what is meant by the pedagogy of the senses, and why the concept of affordance is essential if we want to live towards the future transindividually, that is to say, in excess of the navel-gazing personhood. There is no such thing as a private environment. While memories may feel individual, they are retained collectively, forming transgenerational knowledge that stabilizes the conditions of life. The associated milieu, the fourth milieu, not only allows experiences to be sustained through time, but it also makes them increasingly complex, impacting the production of desire as real ontogenesis rather than imaginary force based on luck. Perception is individuation, and the psychic image should not be seen in opposition to physical movement. Instead, the conditions of real experience are determined at the nexus where the being of the sensible reveals itself affect, while at the same time affordance appears as experimentation. A monad, as a point of view, is defined by its perceptions and appetitions, by experience and desire. When we understand our faculties as being social and not just psychic, we see that affordance, as the evaluation of power, is not simply a matter of identifying objects and uses. Instead, it becomes a bearer of non-Darwinian selection process where technodiversity is just as important as biodiversity. This is a claim recently made by Yuk Hui. Bernard Stiegler's idea of the proletarization of the senses highlights the danger of a single industry dominating the production of art, which can have a profound impact on our perception and desires. To counteract this, Deleuze and Guattari argue for the focus on difference rather than opposition, which they consider as original. If the Leibnizian cogitata comes prior to the Cartesian cogito, then difference and not opposition is thought before we even think of ourselves as the subjects of that thinking. In this context, architecture is not simply a static background against which life takes place, but becomes actively explicated, complicated, and implicated in the very capacities of bodies. It is no wonder that Deleuze and Guattari conclude that art begins not with the flesh, but with the house. Thank you very much for your attention. I'm very happy to. I hope it is particular.
Thank you, Ray. We give the to everybody questions and very so Ola, Andrew, Elisabeth, Jean-Claude, Laurent, Si vous voulez intervenir, eh bien, c'est le moment. Je vois qu'il y a beaucoup de choses à dire. C'est dense.
It's a dense paper. There's a lot of going on here.
It's nothing dense, yes. Moi, je les aurais bien fait.
Sorry, I have my text.
Parmi les ensembles, sinon, Dominique, oui.
Faut parler en anglais ou en français?
Il faut Andrej.
I have one question, but maybe for later.
Yes.
I just wanted to have some kind of reaction to. Sorry, but I arrived in the middle of your presentation, so I missed the beginning. But
maybe the most important.
Sorry?
Maybe the most important.
Yes.
Maybe I answer the question.
But at some point, what you were explaining about the associative milieu, about all this uncut relation between the subject and I would say the space, the relation between the space and the subject, the space and the object. At some point, it was thinking about in philosophy of mathematics or mathematics itself, at the work of Henri Poincaré. You know, exactly when you were talking about this incredible experiment with the cats. And when you read Poincaré, he explained it's incredible because I'm not a specialist, but as far as I know, he maybe had a pre-idea of what the neuroscience today know about the vision. But you will say about not the difference of differences, not pixels, not pixels in the retina.
There is a theorem in neuroscience which is called theorem Poincaré.
Oh, you see, and what he explained, I don't remember in which text in the beginning of the 20th century. He explained that the space itself is kinetic. It's at some point is how the body can move,
yes,
and rotate, and this is what the real space is. Okay, it's not real space. I don't know how to qualify it, and at some point he explained he has a mental experiment. He say, imagine an eye that don't move, and objects moving in front of this eye that cannot move, and I don't exactly remember also what the exactly precise the idea, but he said he couldn't see the distance or the volume, so he couldn't see nothing. So the eye itself needs to move to have some kind of to have vision. So yes, that's so after this and Poincaré. So and just to finish, because the key point here is mathematics is about continuity. You know, discrete versus continuity. So Poincaré is the philosophy of the continuity versus the Cartesian cut vision of things. So just to add.
It's a wonderful point. I just want to say that in this respect, I've learned a lot from Yolanda's intensive science and virtual philosophy, where he literally singled out the lineage. I think Delft belongs there. Humains, Poincaré, all these people who are starting from, let's call it the topological point of view, the differential itself. One person who's written about, a thought experiment that I think was meant to prove how experience, perhaps we couldn't dismiss when I was talking about the distinction between the continuous and the discrete. You could also contrast topology as the geometry of, let's say, that deals with the pure difference before it's difference, the dialectical difference between this and that. One way of looking at it would be to think in terms of different nested geometries, where topology is the most general because it deals with relations exclusively, and Euclidean would be the most specific.
But it is for mathematician. It is Euclidean. It's just a case of a more general space.
This is the Klein also deals with that.
And when I listened to you, at some point, I was just thinking that yes, all these philosophers Deleuze and all these philosophers that read lots of mathematics, that we underestimate how all these great mathematicians were the root of these philosophies.
Yes.
I mean, the core idea were from these mathematicians. They are great artists, let's say, like this. They invent new words and new way of seeing. But mathematical culture is so low today that we forgot that we have a tribute to give to these thinkers.
They try to
We poor architects.
to match the metaphysics with the cutting edge contemporary sciences rather than the other way around.
Yeah.
For find the matching ideas. What also comes to mind is there's a chapter in the book by Charles Sanders Peirce where he has a thought experiment precisely to distinguish between two parables. And Masumi reports on this. He's written an essay about it, namely the Plato's cave, which is because we're talking about kinesthetic ideas. And Plato, he says it's not a coincidence that the beholders are chained. They cannot move. And he says, which tells Sanders Peirce, he says, let's just imagine something for the sake of the argument that you're floating floating, so no gravity. You orient yourself by order of three differentials. One is the proprioceptive sense, the sense that it gives you it's a sense that allows you
to know where is your body in
exactly in relation to itself.
In relation to itself.
Not anything else. The second one is olfactory field. So you go by distinguishing between the lemongrass, this and the different odors, but it's a gradient. It's never a clear cut thing. And the third one is temperature. And he said that as you're floating in this imaginary space, eventually, when you start relating these three differentials, you will be able to actually draw a map of it. So to turn something that is fully topological into something that is traced Euclidean. So he said it's almost like a good parable of how is it that experience could be seen in terms of breaking of symmetry or going from topological space to something that crystallizes in terms of Euclidean geometry. It was at one point considered to be the highest pinnacle of mathematics. But he says the degrees of the breaking of symmetry that actually might explain how is it that actually experience has worked. So experience itself is topological in that sense, and kinetic. What is it? The word
kinetic. And so yes, so we could just finish on this point. We could say that in the Simondonian way to say there is a the associative milieu, there is a continuous pre-space before the subject, the object.
Yes.
For some schools of mathematics, but this is a big debate that discrete spaces arrive after continuous. There is a pre-existence of the continuous, but this is just a point of view. Other mathematicians and the computationalists, for example, like Wolfram, and they say no, it's the contrary, discrete.
Well, it's the same in pure mathematics. When we get into physics, especially quantum physics, the continuity is broken at many levels because, like the position of the particles in the universe, that we can sense.
But have you had a chance? It was a few years ago. Michael Kirby, Smithsonian scholar, has written a book, and he has an essay on quantum indeterminacy at the meso level, at the logical level. And he said it's interesting that we always associate it with the microscale. And he said if you have an object 40 centimeters high, it is completely indeterminate because for a cat, its affordances are different than for a snail, for a human being, for somebody who just broken their leg, this person. So there's this kind of it is full of potential, which is unresolved, always in potential. But I was going to say something else in terms of these implications. What I find really fascinating, I've been following this closely. Erin Manning was working with the autistic subjects. some non-neurotypicals. And she says, what we consider at first sight to be a great advantage, the capacity to see things in terms of discreteness. The door, a person talking to me, wearing a vest, door, blah, blah, blah. She says it also is a problem because it overcoats and it conceals all the hidden untapped potential. For an autistic person, it takes a while to realize what the hell is going on there. They perceive a lot of buzzing possibilities, surfaces that actually they have to make sense of them. You know, this when they have eye tracking device, the autistic person spends equal amount of time observing the background as well as eyes and lips. For a neurotypical, we spend like 85% on the faciality, the face with the machine, because we know it's so overcoding. And she says perhaps one way of looking at it in affirmative way that artists should be a little bit more artistic in the sense that they should not jump to conclusions in terms of chunking the world so quickly so that to miss something. I think there is if you think about children, how they explore actively affordances in a space they don't care whether this. If it's climbable, they will climb it.
What I was coming to is the Piaget and
yes, exactly.
constructivism. So how we build this discretization of the world.
Yes.
So artists should be more going back to the earlier stages of development, which holds more potential.
Yes,
which holds more plasticity. In fact,
it doesn't exclude the discreteness, but
yeah.
it was a re-singularization, going up and falling differently. I apologize. Each time I turn around, I show my back at least one part of the
strange
place.
Thank you.
And later I will have the real question later.
Yes.
Thank you to Milovan and Pavel Janovic.
Milovan is my compatriot.
Bulgarian.
Well.
That Milovan is the Serbian name.
Yes, very.
Somebody wants to ask some.
Just to say, to ask Andrej, maybe if you can go back to your diagram with these words, and you.
Yes. I hope it's a very yes.
You can talk a little bit about.
Second, I have to share now. I'm still sharing, so
yeah.
I just need to go right. I suppose you mean
where there is a new materialism.
Yes, this one.
These two ones.
This is maybe if you want me to describe just a little bit.
Yeah.
That I mean. So here, this is directly from Deleuze's lecture transcript from this, and he talks about. I like it very much because it makes it very easy to describe what is different about what I refer here in the third column as the new materialism. He says that classical thought, he says, is all about the disjunctive couple between essence and appearance. Something is either essence or appearance. It can't be both, and every appearance is of course corrupt in relation to the essence. And then he says something momentous happens with Kant, with the critical term. He says now we don't have the essence and appearance. Now we have the conditions of apparition. And this is conjunctive. He says in order to talk about the apparition, you have to go into what are the conditions of something to appear. Like he says, this is a phenomenology which has been eventually worked out by Husserl and others. But there is there is still a relationship of it's still representational. It is only in the third column where we have the virtual and the actual, or the virtual and the expression, that are conjoined by progressive differentiation from virtual to the actual. So the actual does not have the isomorphic relationship with the virtual, and that's a very breach of anything and anything that's happened so far. So this asymmetry and the fact that it's never exhausted fully the virtual in the actual, but the actual needs the actual because because the virtual is a product of immanence at the same time. So he, in this sense, he wants to distinguish between the visual singular and the universal singular, and this idea of coming, the idea that a concept, I was on and on about it at the very end, that the generalizations don't, or the universal concept don't explain anything that they need to be explained. So how can we come to, how can we make sense of the world? How can we resolve the problem of the one and the many without reducing it to either side? And I think that the real answer, I mean, that the lesson that they provide is this idea of multiplicity, which is not about subsuming all kinds of things under a single concept, whatever it may be, but about relating every concept to those observable variables that mutate. We observe them, and when they change qualitatively, this is also the point where the concept itself transforms and mutates. So even concepts are not, strictly speaking, concepts, because they're continuously mutation adapting to and of course by this is why I also included the idea of ratcheting, which I appropriate from Terence Deacon, the developmental biologist and anthropologist, who talks about ratcheting, because every novelty that is brought into this world rearranges the state of affairs that produces yet another effect that becomes a quasi-cause. So this is, the question is not why there is something rather than nothing. The question is, why is there difference rather than sameness? And recently we hosted Donna Haraway and Rosie Braidotti, the event that was devoted to Lynn Margulis, who is overshadowed by Lovelock with the theory, and she and one of the guests, Bruce Clark, he showed an interview with Margulis, and she says it's interesting along this way of thinking. She said that reality produces always more of itself, and she goes into this rhetoric. She says, and more and more and more and more. I think this is the ratcheting. Why is there difference rather than sameness and bare repetition? This to me is a problem of quasi causality, and I think it is. I agree here. Bernard Stiegler believes that this is probably the greatest distribution.
But all your, I would say all your concept or notions that you are dealing with bring us to Leibniz, but he's not here.
Yes. I indeed. I'm as of recently. I told you
the relational.
Yes.
Which is the base of all what you are thinking.
Indeed.
Is the main operator in Leibniz, and the perspectivism, of course, and all this, and the nomadism, and
indeed, and but I like the way I like the way that Guattari does something with it. So with his modernism is transmodernism, because I think he has the conceptual apparatus to deal with these nested different levels. I like what he does.
And differential, and of course, in this point, in fact, differential is not only a notion and the concept, but it's also not discrete operational operator, because Leibniz is the inventor with Newton at the same time, the calculus of differential.
Yes. Absolutely.
We put it on
Oliver, do you want to speak? Speak to Andrej?
Yeah, did you talk to me now? I'm sorry.
Yes, please. Yes.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. Yeah, I would first of all thank you very much, Andrej. This was extremely interesting and brilliant expose. Very happy to experience this. And yes, you commented yourself. It was a compact. It is lots and lots of extremely interesting material. Can you hear me?
Yes, perfectly.
Yeah. Okay, fine. We could talk for many hours about this, but I would like to, if you could sort of comment a little bit more on, you mentioned Bateson, a difference that makes a difference, and so on, and you brought in the upwards and downwards causation, and in the same sort of connection, you made, I think, a very important point where you said that one unit of information, that is an organism and its environment. Could you comment on a link between the causation and the information in this picture, upward, downwards, and organism environment?
I'm here very much recently on the spell of the book that has just been published a few months ago, and luckily it's an MIT Press open source, so I could simply download it, by Alicia Guerrero. And the book is called Context Changes Everything. And she says that in the past couple of centuries, we have gradually, in our attempt to remove meaning or sense, we have reduced the richness of causality to the efficient cause. So we threw, in one of my essays, I say we threw the, this the cliche thing is to say that the baby of downward causation was thrown out with the dirty water of techno-determinism or determinism.
Yeah.
So I think she said one of the problems is that if we go back to the four Aristotelian causes that are reworked in schizoanalytic cartographies by Guattari, he turned them into territories, universes of constellations, or universes of value, machinic phyla, and material flows, semiotic and material signalectic flows. It looks like what this reduction to the efficient cause is the reduction to thermodynamics, and somehow information is left out. Or what Elizabeth Gross, she's written a book on the incorporeal. I forgot there is a long subtitle, but she devotes a lot of space to this idea that so for me, like Aristotelian final and formal cause are incorporeal, therefore they're just left out. I see them as quasi, in terms of quasi-causality. And I think this is where Guattari is really right in pointing out that there is something about this universes of value. If we fully, he said, to do with the associated milieu, he said if a body fully coincides with its territory, that's catatonic. It's just we need to be able to think about the not the possible, but the virtual. And this is where Masumi says that he reminds us that probably Guattari, provoked by Bateson, to start thinking about the values as residing in the realm of the virtual. So in the book, The Generalized Ecology, Eric Horrell is an edited volume. Masumi actually chooses it for the title of his essay. It says virtual values, so this is where so to try to answer your question. So for me, it's organism plus environment. I now with a colleague of mine, we have just started drafting the possible table of contents for a book that we want to write together. It's an experiment, and we want to, after Bateson, to call it environment plus organism, just to do a little reversal, because it's very common to start with the organism. And we thought it would be nice to actually make a point, very Gibsonian point, that the subject is the effect of affect or affordance. So to start with the environment, and actually the core, the book would contain 3 parts: organism, plus, and in the environment. And I think most of the things would actually happen in the plus, in the coming together, in the middling of how is it that we relate. Because what Huarero does, and of course what Terence Deacon does, is to remind us that the if indeed we buy, and I think it's undisputable that the matter and energy is constant. This is the first law of thermodynamics. So what is it that it's not constant? It's the second law of thermodynamics, namely yes, what do you call it?
Negentropy.
Yes, negentropy. So the local resistance to local deferral of entropy in terms of negentropy, and this is this is all we have ever been doing, and how the matter, which is constant, is nevertheless. We can. There's still space for manipulation, tinkering to produce different manners, and that's the what I was referring to when I said the unlimited finity. So there's finity on one hand, but there's also the unlimitedness of the possibilities that we can still, in terms of what if tinkering, stumble upon. And so that's the plus of Gregory Bateson's when he says, you know what he says in one of his lectures, he says that it makes no sense to describe the anatomy of half a chicken. He says if you're talking about the organism or the environment, you're talking about half a chicken. You need the whole chicken, and that's the plus.
Do you make any connection from that to the transindividuation concept?
Yes, indeed, absolutely. I think individual. I mean, this is I'm thinking of this the cascade where the physical individuation, and Simondon always uses the beautifully evocative idea of the crystal, how it grows, but it's completely indifferent to its interiority because it has no interiority. In other words, no memory. And then he goes to the vital, but what makes it vital is this moment, and eventually also psychic individuation, is once you can ponder alternatives. It is you're not motivated solely by circumstances, but now you have retention that actually feed pretensions or prehension in the right. So this is the moment that memory is getting more and more autonomous, more and more detached from the body proper. And so when we come to transduction, I think I connected to the third, the tertiary memory, where it's completely emancipated from the genetic and the epigenetic level, because it becomes sedimented, and therefore it becomes I mean, the reason why I say it's not simply about adapting to the circumstances. Now by manipulating our environment, we can leave a transgenerational associated milieu that has the capacity, almost like Lamarck, who is disparaged, comes with a revenge, in the sense that we do indeed we are not passively adapting, but we are adopting. And therefore, we can immediately be in touch with transgenerationally. Because I'm drawn to. There is a beautiful point in Deleuze when he says language operates in a way that it goes from the person who has not experienced to the person who has not experienced. By contrast to bees, a bee sees a beautiful comes across a beautiful field of flowers, and it can communicate it to the bee that has not seen it. That they can do. But the tertiary memory makes it possible for us who have not seen to communicate stuff to those who have not seen it. So that's a different order of this. To me, this goes to the core of transindividuation. The fact that the level of autonomy of memory, this is exosomatized in such a way that it's a monument in the lesson terms. It stands on its own. It doesn't need anybody to take care of it, and it has the capacity to communicate with far, way into the future. So you pick up a piece of artifact, and you don't need to know anything about its creator, and it already starts resingularizing one's brain. This is the evolution by means another day life. What Stigler was on about, and I think this is what transindividuation wills, because it's not interindividual. It's not about. It's about what happens in between that, and I think any ontogen, if we are lucky enough, any event that we organize, such as this one, it's not about me with a completely made up mind trying to convince you of something over there. It's about what happens in the middle that. Hopefully, by the time we leave this room, we are provoked into maybe considering something that we have not considered so far.
Yeah, exactly. It's a sort of a meeting, an interface between upwards and downward causation, also, isn't it?
Yes, yes, absolutely. I think this is why I find ratcheting a very promising diagram. Because it's irreversible. I recently came across because I'm unlucky. I can't read French, so I have to wait for somebody to be kind enough. So they translated finally Simondon's invention and what is it called? It's his lecture series from 1965-66.
Invention, I don't remember, but yeah.
Imagination and
no.
An invention, I think. Imagination and invention, it's called. And he goes into the ontology of images, and he distinguishes between. He says it's a cycle, but this cycle turns out to be a spiral. He says we start with the motor image, which belongs to it's Lucretius. It's about swarms of any kind, be it atoms or celestial bodies. Would be like that level. Then we move to perception, something that is so the one is a priori. The movement of thirst, of sucking before you know that it's your mother it already occurs at the level of the motion movement image. Then he goes to the perception image. He goes to eventually to he calls it a mental image or concept image. We could call it a symbolic image. And then he ends with something that he calls invention image or object image. And he says once we arrive at the object image, it's transindividual because it's produced collectively, but now it feeds back and it becomes a motor image. And this is the ratcheting mechanism that explains how images are sufficiently disconnected, but also not, they don't belong to the idealist, they're sufficiently disconnected, but also connected enough so that they allow for the possibility of us capacity to invent is precisely hinges on this side, indeterminacy of the image that is neither in Bergsonian terms, neither a thing nor an idea, but both in between. And he's crazy. He goes through as if this is not complex enough. Each of these four images goes through three different levels, where he talks about the whole of biology. When you are afraid of something, you flee. The whole of your body is as it were occupied. But then there's a point where you can compartmentalize and you can ponder options, and then it's not the whole of your body; it's just part of you, and that's how he, I believe, describes the psychic individuation and so on. It's beautiful stuff. I think a lot to chew on. But I was trying to answer your question about the plus, and I ended up discussing the idea of ratcheting. This is, I think, super important. And maybe if I could just throw in something, because I think it also painted my mood when I was writing this. I am really also fascinated by this provocative statement of Hugh Huis, where he says, we all agree, there's full agreement among all scholars or that biodiversity is important. But he wants to say that if we were to take these things seriously, then technodiversity is equally important, because otherwise we end up in the cultural industry, Adorno and Horkheimer, somebody else feeds us images and controls what is it that we desire. Because as you know, every time you buy a book online, they tell you, here are other books that people like you read. But why would I want to be like people like me? I mean, I'm already me, and I'm sick of myself. I want to read what. So this idea of technodiversity, I think, is very profound, because we have to, get rid of ourselves of ourselves first and foremost.
Great point. Great point. I was thinking when you were talking there, I came to think of John Krakauer, one of the guys at the Santa Fe Institute, and he proposed a wonderful concept, I think, neurodynamic objects. As that's sort of the
yes,
just coining, sketching, proposing a concept for that thing between.
Yes. Lovely. I didn't know that. Thank you. Maybe if I just quickly respond. Deacon has this lovely cascade. He says, in nature, we know about homeostasis, and it's very important where things come, as it were, in a certain balance. Then he talks about morphogenesis, but different from Rouillet, in the sense that how the shape is formed, because there's asymmetry, precisely because it's not homeostatic, something happens. But then he says there's something that he calls telodynamisms, and this is the capacity to. This comes from form. The fact that you have form that sustains itself, and that's incredible. Without, of course, being centrally controlled. But and I think these the ladies that I mentioned, Donna Haraway and Rosie Bredotti and Bruce Clark, they were actually saying that Gaia theory is often misunderstood. Perhaps it should be rather than seen in terms of like New Age, hippie thing. It is a teleodynamic system, which is extraordinary, because they tried to recreate, these experiments when they it could be a small scale, whether you can have a little contained environment created, but none of that lasts very long. It collapses on itself. How is it that we have reached here the conditions that there is enough of moisture, water? Water is the atmosphere is incredible, because there are very similar planets, but that at one point the traces did have the conditions for life, but they soon the water evaporated and it was gone. It's something extraordinary happened here in terms of telodynamism that kept everything within certain parameters, so that it can perpetuate and sustain itself, and that's very different from. This is. I see it in terms of quasi-causality. Something happened, the effect turned into a quasi-cause that kept something, as I said, sustained itself. Nothing is indefinite, but for a long time. No. Thank you for this reference. I wrote it down, but I'm keen reader. I'll now that I have finally get to meet you, I will go back to your papers. And luckily, there are things online, so we can.
Yes. Yes, and no, it was really so much appreciated hearing you talk, and fun that you're at the TU Delft. You permanently there?
Yes, I've been there since almost 20 years now. But I think this is I'm on this recording, so I have to be careful what I say. I see our group as a kind of dissident group. Nobody really cares about things that we do, which is the blessing and the curse at the same time.
Okay, we are not alone. Okay, that's
Yeah, and the internet remembers everything.
Yes.
So be careful.
Forever. Yes.
Yeah, I see. So, right. Now we should with Patrice is doing this wonderful work in Paris, and you in Delft, and I must admit I've been quite a lonely figure in Trondheim. So it would be nice to sort of, I mean, it seems like this foam is reaching a point where it would be able to expand.
Yes. Absolutely, definitely.
I'm sure.
I think that wouldn't that be nice, Patrice?
encore une autre question et après, parce que Andrej doit partir à 18h.
Absolument précise.
Another question?
Yes, it's true.
Sure.
Thank you very much.
I have questions, but
Yes.
honneur aux visiteurs.
Oui.
Mademoiselle, pas de question. Laurent ou Jean-Claude, si vous avez quelques observations, je vais les faire même en français et en traduction.
Can I maybe mention this has been a very fruitful beginning of the year for me, because yesterday I delivered a long lecture at the event on the work of Radmann and
On doit dire que Andrej is one of the most interested people in the world for the French philosopher, donc le philosophe français Raymond Rollier, qui est une référence après avoir été oublié pendant des années. Il est maintenant dans comment on appelle ça, en tout cas la bibliographie de l'EHESS depuis une quinzaine d'années. Et c'est la référence, bien sûr, vous voyez, de Deleuze, Guattari, Foucault et d'autres. Et c'est peut-être la philosophie, ce qui peut-être intéresse Andrej. Je peux continuer en français, Andrej, ou...
oui.
C'est que Rollier, c'est une des philosophies qui a vraiment, un peu à la manière classique, essayé de faire... de développer une métaphysique avec une science, avec une morale, avec une éthique, et donc c'est un connaisseur des sciences, que ce soit physique, mathématiques, biologie, etc., mais aussi de dimension métaphysique, morale, etc.
I just put it in the chat for those who are interested, the link to this.
Est-ce que je peux rapidement poser une question? Yes.
Il a dû dire juste quelque chose.
Ah, ok.
So, Andrej,
Yes.
Want to show, to make the link to the conference on Raymond Rollier, dans les écoles d'architecture.
And the second link is for our YouTube page, where we have there was a Bernard Stiegler's event, and so for anybody who wants to.
Yes, because I missed some point of the presentation. As you had a slide, you were saying drawing is not writing.
Yes.
And architecture does not speak.
Yes.
What was the point here?
Robin,
It does not signify.
yes,
This
is Robin Evans, who wonderful British writer who passed away, I think, before reaching the age of 50, which is such a. and I think he published 2 books. One is a translation from buildings to from drawing to buildings. It's all his essays, and he's the one very Guattarian. I'm not sure. I don't think he ever refers to Guattari directly, but I think this idea of asignifying signification, the fact that not everything needs to be reduced. The alternative, what's the word I'm looking for?
To meaning, you mean to reduction to what?
Linguistic signification.
To linguistic. Okay, so that's your key point. So linguistic is a reduction.
It's a reduction.
By
C'est postmodernisme, c'est contre le postmodernisme qui est
contre le postmodernisme.
Oui,
d'accord.
Ce sont toujours des problèmes de malentendu.
Let me find.
Yes. Okay, I will check this.
Let me show you because I have one quote I didn't read. This is what he said. And this is Guattari. No, this is what he says. Students of semiotics are already divided into those who relate semiotics to the sciences of language and those who consider language merely one among other instances of functioning a general semiotic. It seems to me that the result of this debate, is that in the first case, desire gets bogged down in the imaginary by becoming invested in the system of significant flights, which I shall call paradigmatic perversion, where in the second, it participates in asignifying semiotic engagements involving signs as well as things, individuals as well as groups, organs as well as forces or machines. I have, in 2014, I edited an issue of Footprint on the topic of asignifying signification. Precisely and I use this title directly. I appropriated from Evans, Robin Evans. I mean, Guattari says, how would you, for example, a credit card, the magnetic tape on it doesn't mean anything, just works, and it develops pretty, very, to my mind, convincing idea of how. He has a diagram how linguistic semiotics is but a very small island in a huge sea of other semiosis. I think could be like a process of producing science.
I think this book of How Forest Thinks.
That would be exactly.
For example, yes,
that would be
exactly everywhere. Everything speaks.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
That's what I meant. The key point of your presentation is no reduction.
Yes,
at the end. I mean,
exactly. That's what I mean. Reduction ecology. For me, this is ecology. Trying to
never reduce the potential, the virtual, the potential, and never reduce and don't reduce language itself.
Yes. Because also the very structure of language is prejudicial in the sense that you already starts with the subject related to heading. So you cannot think that this, in the middle, you start from fully, this and then.
I was just reacting to it because I'm working on writing, of digital writing, on the notion of writing. So it's discrete system.
Yes.
I try to go beyond this, but in my research, I was a bit, let's say, surprised that I started opposing drawing and writing, but I see that all the research, the contemporary research, they never oppose it. And drawing is a language, and writing is a language, and they are maybe not the same, but they're very.
So I was the book that I strongly recommend. If you haven't had the chance to read it, it's Paul Baines. It's called The Primacy of Semiosis. Paul Baines. BF. Let me just spell it. Or maybe I can find it quickly here, so that second. Okay. Here it is. He's a Hungarian. Okay. This one, The Primacy of Semiosis, Ontology of Relations. He also wrote a very short piece called Subject as Subject. It's a beautiful book. I think you will be really interested in that.
Okay. Ontology of relations.
It's, I mean, really recommended. What is it, 2006?
Thank you.
It's Matsume is another good source because for him, it's relation is not interaction. Interaction. That's so I'm wondering. Is it Adrian Forti has a book on words and buildings, and then he lists in terms of architect also.
Yes.
He lists all the examples. I believe is it Chumi? I mean, there's somebody who's written their graduation work rather than so the whole book is that is it this, is it that, is it both? How do they differ and so on? Words and buildings.
Words and buildings.
Yes,
The author, the name of the author is
Forti, Adrian Forti. Forti as in as the number.
Cette minute avant la fin,
Oui.
la communication. Personnellement, j'aurais eu beaucoup de choses à dire, mais je fais une traduction du mauvais anglais sur les relations évidemment entre monadologie, monadisme et puis phylogénétique. Alors, cela m'intéresse énormément. Je continue en français ou en English?
I understand the
So, no, I'm very impressed about your interpretation about Fordon's effect and your synthesis is very, very, very strong and very clear. But there is some specific questions to analyze, like for example, monadology. The question about monad, a monadic system, because it's interesting when we connect it with epiphylogeneity. It seems that it's the milieu, the ambient, that produce the individual,
yes.
the specificity.
Yes.
And this is perhaps the nature of the monadic system or the position of the monadism. I know you speak about it. It's not only on Leibniz tradition, it's a medieval tradition. We find it in the 13th century and before. And this it's interesting because I try to use another concept like heterogenesis in the way to explain that individuals are not alone as they are produced like a Darwinian position by the ambient.
Yes. Yes.
The milieu. And the milieu produce the species, etc. And buildings also, there is no originality today to produce buildings. It seems architects are artists,
Yes.
but they are not. In a certain way, they are only producers.
Yes.
They build with the ambient and the culture. As you said before, the very in your text, in your explanation, there is buildings make our shape our brain.
Exactly.
And we see and we our behavior are constructed
Yes.
by this, and we can't change these positions. It's very, very strong, very interesting.
One example that I use, and I really, and now I mean, perhaps would be helpful. I'm using Guattari's ideas from speech analytic cartographies to try to see in terms of the irreducibility and monology, transmonadism. And I use an example. I put together Guattari's speech analytic cartographies together with the delirious New York, because I think it offers a beautiful showcase. So I'm thinking if Guattari is talking about the 4 ontological domains, and then he talks about the flow as one of them, which would be in Aristotelian terms material cause. For Guattari, it's a flow. And I'm thinking about Otis, who at one point invents an elevator. So I'm deliberately starting from architecture from the most technical, unexpected device that was simply an invention. So suddenly an elevator makes it possible, and this is the delirious New York, to multiply the data. So you have the floors stuff. And so that produces something that in architecture would be a typology of a skyscraper, which is innovative. It's never happened before. Most of the other species of architecture are transformed so that the theater becomes a cinema. There is always like a small inflections to come to the next stage. But this, it's the trick, the flow that created a machinic phylum, a set of diagrammatic codes that now we have to take care of. Floor plan and how many staircases, elevators, and so on. This in turn creates the culture of congestion. So suddenly you have the capacity to put many people together, but of course, interestingly, penthouse is the most valuable space. So the Kofa says the further far you are from the ground, the better the condition. And that's the previously would be referred to as the final cause. But then you have the new subject. We call it the metropolitan subject, and the famous image of a bachelor eating oysters naked on the 9th floor with the gloves on. I mean, it says, who could in their right mind ever imagine anything like this from happening? So talking about the New York architecture and everything. So these 4 things, these 4 domains. So is it the elevator that created the possibility of going vertical, that created the culture of congestion, that created the metropolitan subject? Or is it the metropolitan subject that desires actually flow and movement that's built into the... So you find yourself in something that is, it's literally, as you say, heteropoiesis. It would be foolish of us to say it started here. Deleuze and Guattari always say, things start in the middle where they pick up speed. Who cares where they come from? The myth of the origin is comes from this desire to tame things, to control them, but that's not really necessary. Nor do we want to know where they are going. And I think this is why it's neo-finalism rather than finalism, because the target is moving, and the ratcheting system produces ever more this heterogenesis produces more and more in Margulis, more and more and more and more. And I think Kochas was ahead of everybody in that sense of thinking in terms of the associated milieu and how we produce, let's say, the delirious New York, and the New York produces the delirious metropolitan subject. Perhaps if I was more clever, I could come up maybe with more contemporary. But Guattari has another example. He says it wasn't enough for Leonardo da Vinci to think about flying machine. It took quite a while for the flow to be invented to propel the flight, for the codes, the machinic phylum to regulate that we now have radars and corridors for airports and so on. So that even the event of flight, you can also see from the 4 domains of ontological domains of Guattari that are the flow, the machinic phylum, the diagram, the objective idea, the subjective idea, the value of light is an idea of which is the opposite of gravity, the grace, as I was trying to say, and plus a subject now that we were not meant to fly, but we do fly now, and it's not, and now it's irreversible, because now we have this it's a part of our. That's I think maybe also goes in the direction of upholding the idea of technodiversity. It produces ever more emancipatory potential, perhaps, no, but I'm always cautious here because it's for good and for bad. I don't want to say.
Yeah, I understand. Well, it's a big problem to solve.
Big program.
The time is over,
Yes.
and you have to take your train, and so we conclude.
Thank you very much.
My pleasure. Thank you. Thank you.
Au revoir.
Thank you,
À
thank you,
bientôt,
Andrej.
Ole.
Thank you very
Next
much.
time, Ole.
You're very kind.
Wonderful.
Au revoir, Jean-Claude. Je suis désolé que je n'ai pas pu bien entendre. Je suis désolé.
Oui, c'est... Bon, bah, écoute, c'est comme ça. On en reparlera.
On fait avec les moyens, mais modestes. En tout cas, merci à tout le monde et puis on se retrouve, je crois que ce sera le 4 mars. Voilà. À bientôt. Au revoir.
Bonne soirée.
À bientôt. Thank you, Patrice. Thank you,
Very much.
Andrej. Everybody. Thank you.
Little festival, I'm always reminded of this habit in